All right, Jeff. So the first question I always like to ask people, what were you like growing up? And you can take it in whatever direction you'd like, interests, personality traits, whatever. When you think back to your childhood, what are the things that stand out?
Well, I grew up in a really small town in upstate New York called Mahopac, and very small, and it was kind of idyllic. I grew up on a street, like a big hill, and every winter we'd be sledding. Summers we'd be playing night tag. It was a great, great place to grow up. And when I was a huge sports geek, like a huge sports geek. Like my room was covered, it's cliche, but my room was covered with posters of Bo Jackson and Don Mattingly and Earl Campbell and Walter Payton and every athlete you could think, just covered. And nobody in my family cared about sports except for me. I was the only one. And I would sit in front of the TV by myself because nobody else cared, with a mitt or with a football, mimicking the players. And the thing that was, just a random answer, but the thing that was big for me was there was a library. I was a big runner as a kid. I ran track and cross country and all that stuff. And there's a library about a mile from us in town, the Mahopac Public Library. And they knew I was the kid who loved sports books. So whenever they get a new book in, whatever, Ron Guidry wrote an autobiography or Bo Jackson wrote, they would actually, a librarian there would call me and say, "Hey, Jeff, before we put it out, just so you know, Bo Jackson's new book is in. I'll hold it for you if you get down here quick." And I would leave my front door, run the mile and a half to the library with I can picture my white and black library card in my hand, take out the book, run home, go into my room, and just read it and absorb it. And I was just absorbing sports books from the time I was probably 10 to the time I left for college, just absorbing them. I was just fascinated by that stuff. So I was kind of a sports geek who ran a lot of road races.
Okay, so I got a few questions from that. So I had the opposite childhood, I guess, in a lot of ways. Grew up in a big city in Dallas and then had a family full of sports fans. And that helped cultivate my love for sports. I wasn't forced into it. I mean, it was very natural, but I look right, I got my dad, look left, I got my brothers, and we're all kind of into it. So how did that help you become a sports fan, like being the lone duck, or I guess how did that dynamic of not having that maybe help or hurt, or maybe help or hurt aren't the right terms here, but what was that dynamic like?
All right, so I'll tell you one thing that's funny. The only sport I even care about now as far as any fandom left is football, and I grew up a New York Jets fan, which is just the worst. And the reason I became a Jets fan, it's one of my favorite stories, is I have an older brother named David. He's 2 years older. And when he was about maybe 8 and I was 6, we were sitting at the kitchen table one day, and he says, "I'm going to be a Giants fan." And I said, "I'll be a Jets fan." He could not, if Lawrence Taylor or Eli Manning knocked on his door, he would have no idea who they are. Like, he hasn't watched the Giants game since. And I've been saddled with this dog-awful franchise for the last 35 years just because my brother at age 8 randomly decided to be a Giants fan. So I'd say the biggest negative of it all is I could have had all the, if he'd said he'd been a Jets fan, I would have all these Super Bowls I would have enjoyed. Instead, I'm stuck with this mess. I think the thing, I think I was always a curiosity to my parents. Like they used to joke, like they would actually joke. They'd say, maybe you were adopted, or maybe we picked the wrong kid up because it doesn't make any sense. The thing I think it did for me, this isn't quite the answer, but I grew up in a really, really sheltered town. It was very white. It was very socially conservative. New York City was only an hour and 20 minutes away, but a lot of kids I grew up with never went to New York City, or they were afraid of New York City. My family, we went in all the time. But these books and sports, it sounds corny, but I swear to God it's true. Like, it really introduced me. Like, I was a huge fan of, like, afros and lamb chop sideburns and guys named, like, Raphael and Omar. And, I remember, like, the Mets had a shortstop, Al Pedrique, and I just love the name Al Pedrique. And I remember Gary Templeton was the Padres shortstop, and he just looked so cool with, like, his mini fro and his cool sideburns. And I feel like what sports did for me, and being that kid, was to really, in a weird way, without going that many places, expose me to all these sort of cultures that I wanted to experience and all these things I wanted to see. and probably had a really pronounced impact on me becoming a sports writer.
That's so, and then I guess with that, I'm curious, that in combination with your thirst to learn and to read, like when you were reading these books at first, I guess you said that, like, you're around 10 when that really started. Were you reading them with any thought in the back of your mind, like, this is what I want to do? Or were you reading them totally innocently, like, hey, this is awesome, I love absorbing this material?
Well, I think at first it started as innocently. And then what happened is my parents would not take the big dive and get me a Sports Illustrated subscription because it was 52 weeks and it was a lot of money. And two things happened. Number one is I had a neighbor. I barely knew them, but their name was John and Ann Daly, and they subscribed to Sports Illustrated. And every so often they would wrap up all their Sports Illustrateds and put them at the curb to be picked up by the recycle guy or the garbage man. And I would run over there. I'm sure they had no idea, and steal the Sports Illustrated. And I would just put them in my room and just read the SIs. And then my mom signed me up for a subscription to Sport Magazine, which no longer exists. But it came once a month. And I would read that and just absorb it and love it. And I guess you start getting the idea, oh, this is something you can do. This is actually a profession. And I think I was a high school sophomore. And I said to my mom one day, I was like, I'm going to write for Sports Illustrated. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to write for Sports Illustrated. And I remember her saying to me, she's like, well, you have to be realistic in your goals. And I was like, no, you don't understand. I'm going to write for Sports Illustrated. I guarantee you I'm going to write for Sports Illustrated. And to her, it was such a foreign idea because, number one, she didn't care about sports. Number two, being a journalist seemed like this thing that was like that other people did. You know, like I was a Jewish kid in New York. You become a doctor, you become a lawyer, you become a dentist, whatever. Like, it didn't seem feasible. It was like saying to my mom, I wanted to be a Broadway performer or, sing, whatever, a pop star. But I think stealing the dailies magazines, getting sport magazines, seeing that there were these writers who got paid to write about sports sort of triggered something in me.
Was there one book in particular that you connected with, or that you just, years removed, you still kind of remember the impact it might have had on you, either just the joy or the message or whatever the case might be?
All right, so there are a couple it's kind of weird. There was a book. There used to be an outfielder for the Detroit Tigers named Ron LaFleur. And Ron LaFleur was discovered by the Tigers in prison. He was actually an inmate in a prison in Michigan, and he was a really good player on the prison baseball team. And the Tigers went to see him. Billy Martin was a manager, and they signed him, and he wound up being an all-star in the majors. I remember getting his book as a kid. I think it was called Stealing Home, and thinking, man, this is insane. Like, again, a world I had no familiarity with. It's funny, I'm writing a Bo Jackson biography as we speak, and Bo Jackson's book, Bo Knows Bo, which came out, I think, when I was 17, was a huge moment for me. Like, that book was huge to me and really influential. And the last one, I'd say, there was a book, and I wrote a USFL book a few years ago. There was a book when I was a kid called The $1 League by Jim Byrne, and it was about the USFL. And I just absorbed that book. And I wound up, when I was a senior in high school, we had to do a senior thesis for like AP English to graduate, and they assigned a 20-page paper, which seemed huge. And I ended up writing 40 pages on the downfall of the USFL, all because of that Jim Byrne book that I read when I was a kid. And I'm sure the USFL book I wound up writing never exists if I didn't read the Jim Byrne book when I was probably 14 years old.
I was going to say there's a tie there with your future endeavors.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. Okay, so you grow up in this small town. You're kind of a lone duck in your love for sports, and I think a lot of people that do more or less what we do, and all, the journalism, the sports journalism, there are a lot of like, I was an athlete and it stopped at some point, high school, 7th grade, college, whatever, and I wanted to stay in sports. And then there are people like yourself who maybe early on kind of developed this love for the journalism side. So when you went to college, what was the goal there? I mean, we were talking off air. I went to school close by where you are now at USC, and I knew what I at least wanted to try. I didn't know if I'd be any good at it. I didn't know if it would ever work out. But I went there with like a direct knowledge of what I wanted to pursue. Was that the same for you?
Yeah, very much. So I ran 1 year of track and cross country at Delaware, and I was very bad. It was not my future to be a Division I runner of any type. But it was a goal of mine to run Division I somewhere in college, like an absolute goal. And I did it, got my butt kicked, enjoyed it. when I was a senior in high school, I wrote for my local weekly newspaper, the Patent Trader, and I got a lot of clips out of it. I learned a ton out of it. There was a sports editor named Joe Lombardi who really mentored me. And when I got to Delaware, I knew I wanted to be a journalist. Like I absolutely knew. And it's a funny thing. You had to meet with an advisor heading into your freshman year. So I had this meeting with this advisor, which I can still picture in my head. And she said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I'm going to write for the student newspaper this year. And one day I'm going to be editor of the paper. And she's like, yeah, freshmen aren't allowed to write for the newspaper. And I said, yeah, I don't care. I'm going to find a way. I'm going to write for the newspaper. And it turns out she was the girlfriend of one of the outgoing editors of the college newspaper. And she told all the people at the editor about this cocky jackass freshman who was coming in and thought he was going to be like the man. So I showed up and they all knew I was coming, but I did have all these clips from my local paper. And I did end up writing as a freshman for the paper. And two things that happened as a freshman. Number one, I was so cocky and unlikable and so unwelcoming of editing. They actually fired me from writing. I started writing, and one day an editor pulled me aside and said, nobody wants you up here anymore. And I was crying in my dorm room and ended up writing a letter to them apologizing and let me write again. And the other thing that happened is I went to the University of Delaware, and at the time, Delaware and Delaware State, both 1AA schools in football, never played each other in any sports. And Delaware State was a small black college, historically black college. Delaware was this big, predominantly white college. And I told the editors I want to write this story about Delaware playing Delaware State, not playing Delaware State. And they were like, yeah, okay, go ahead. But they didn't give it much thought, but sure, go ahead. And I just dug into that thing hardcore. And I wrote this story, and I handed it in. And I had these really inflammatory quotes from the athletic director at Delaware and all this stuff. Well, the story ended up running on the front page of the student newspaper. And I think 2 months later, Delaware and Delaware State agreed to play in sports. And it was my first moment where I really, really saw the impact you can have if you do this rightly. And for me, that was huge, just huge.
That's crazy. So that's you always read these stories and then there's some sort of an impact because someone sees this or sees that. But for that to happen so soon in college, did that just further motivate you? What was that feeling like, and how did that kind of impact you? You said it, you obviously recognized the power of what you were doing, but how did that really kind of impact you as you figured out what you really wanted to pursue as next projects or next career paths, if you will?
Oh, it was. I can't even properly. I never talk about this, so it's actually funny to talk about. I can't tell you how big of a deal that was to me. And I remember a few things the Wilmington, we did that story. I wrote the story, and the Wilmington News Journal, which is the biggest paper in the not very big state of Delaware, did a follow-up based off of that story. And a columnist for the Wilmington News Journal named Kevin Noonan wrote a column about it, and he praised my piece in the student newspaper. And I was floating on air. I really was floating on air. And then we had a legendary journalist as one of the professors at Delaware, a guy named Chuck Stone. And I heard him on a radio interview later that year praising my story and I always try to remember what it is to be 18, 19 years old and what older journalists mean to people from that perspective. It's easy to forget as you become an older journalist what your words mean to younger journalists, and I always try to remember that because those things really made a difference to me. And it just, I don't know, it really pumped me up. It really pumped me up, and it showed holy crap, you do this, and you can actually make an impact. And if you just work hard at it, and you bust your ass, and you do all these things, you have a shot of actually making things change or having people take notice. And it's still one of my favorite moments of my lifetime of writing is Delaware versus Delaware State, the sports rivalry that never was. That story on page 1 of the stupid University of Delaware newspaper.
Do you still have, is that something that's framed in your house, or do you have any sort of memory of that, physically?
It's in a scrapbook. I don't have a frame. The only newspaper I have framed is one of my biggest mistakes ever, which is I did become editor of the student newspaper at Delaware. And my senior year, I was really, really, again, really cocky and really not very sensitive. And we did a April Fool's issue my senior year, which it was kind of funny but not great. And we did. It was the biggest mistake of my career as a journalist. Is we were going through old file photos to find pictures of to use in the April Fool's issue, and I found a photo of a short-statured student from several years earlier. And, we're all a bunch of 20, 21-year-olds, and we think everything is funny, and we just make fun of people. What's a big deal? We put him on the front page of the newspaper, put a football helmet over his head with the headline, "Midgets Fight to Take Over Newark." Newark, Delaware is where University of Delaware is. And I think it's the funniest thing ever, blah, blah, blah. A few days later, the phone rings at the office. It's this kid's mother, who still lives in the town of Newark, Delaware, just lambasting me and telling me how many years it took her son to get over all the mocking and the humiliation and just the stigma that's attached with being a short-statured person in America. And the hurt in her voice, I can still hear. And long story, that's the one issue I actually have somewhere, in large part because it reminds me of what a jackass I was.
Jeff, that's interesting because I feel like sometimes, and I don't want to, at risk of generalizing, there are people who, and maybe this is a little different, but there are people, writers, broadcasters, that they're like, there's no empathy, and it's like, well, that's the reality. They are this, or they did that. They shouldn't have said it if they didn't want, it's, but like I've heard you before in an interview, comment on something the way you kind of approached writing about Charles Haley in your book about the Cowboys, which is outstanding, but that you kind of feel bad about that. And you bringing that up now, I guess I don't want to like jump to a conclusion, but it seems like you are someone who will kind of reflect a lot. And I'm wondering how that's kind of impacted you as you've grown from that cocky freshman to where you are now as as an author, a journalist, and a parent, and taking on all these different roles from when you were just this 18, 19-year-old kid.
I mean, it's the one thing about writing books that I really struggle with in a lot of ways. Like the Haley thing Haley's a good example. Like, I just wasn't. It all seems so funny to me. There's this guy and he's masturbating in front of teammates and blah 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 and ha 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 ha. And then you're like I didn't have the wherewithal to think maybe this guy's bipolar. Maybe this guy suffers from some severe mental disorders and actually maybe I should back off a little bit. And I kind of hate that. And at the same time, it's like I wrote Walter Payton's biography, and Walter Payton was deceased by the time I was working on it. And there was one part of the book where I wrote about he had a test and it found out he had herpes, right? And I put it in the book. And I was just thinking later, like why? What did that add to the story? Like what? That doesn't add anything. It doesn't really tell you anything about him. It doesn't make the book any better. It's just almost like using information because showing off that you found information. And I feel like when I was much younger, it was just head down, do what you got to do, get everything you can and put it out there. And I don't know what's happened, but I've definitely become, I always say to my kids, I have 2 kids, and one of my life mantras is don't make someone's life harder because you're in it. And I really believe that. And it's one of the catch-22s of writing books because inevitably you're going to find information when you do a biography that you kind of have to write about, but it's not going to please the person or make the person always look good. And it bothers me. I don't know what the answer to it is, but it bothers me.
So I want to get to the book that I just read of yours, Ring Circus, which certainly I'm sure there were some hurdles and some interesting elements to this because this is about the Lakers dynasty in the Shaq Kobe era. Obviously, Kobe Bryant's no longer with us. That's a complicated deal because I think, right or wrong, when someone dies, especially the way that he did, you hear an outpouring of all the great and the not so great, of which there were certainly plenty with Kobe. It just goes to the back, and this book does not ignore that stuff. And I'm just curious. Okay, so when did you start? Like when did the idea come about for a timeline purpose? When was this idea something that you were going to pursue?
So all right, so I was done with the USFL book, which came out 2.5 years ago now, and I started thinking of different books. And I'd written a book called Showtime about the Magic Johnson era, and I just thought, I thought Shaq, Kobe, Phil Jackson, huge subjects. Regional because I live in Southern California, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd say about probably 3 years ago is when it first started germinating in my head.
Okay, and so in what stage of the process were you when the helicopter accident occurred and Kobe passed?
I was done. Like, the book was done. I think it was fully edited. I was literally sitting in a coffee shop when I found out that he died. A friend of mine texted me and said, whatever, rumor is Kobe Bryant just died in a helicopter crash. So everything was completed. And it was sort of like, after the shock and everything of it, I couldn't rewrite the book, and I don't think I would have rewritten the book in any way. But I just wanted to add something at the beginning to maybe add some perspective to it, which was pretty much what they let me do.
Okay, so how far? Okay, so when it was January, right? I think it was January.
Yeah, January 26th, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Because I remember I was getting ready to broadcast a G League basketball game, and it just the way it impacted the entire basketball community. It was a day game. Mm-hmm. We were sitting there, and it was like we weren't sure if we were even going to play the game. And Del Harris happened to be there, and so we brought Del Harris onto the broadcast to talk about his memories and obviously his relationship with Kobe, which you go into in the book. It's not like this was some incredible Tim Duncan, Greg Popovich relationship, but I mean, it just so happened he was there, and he was, I guess, a somewhat significant part of Kobe's entry into the NBA. But for you, so was there ever a consideration, like, do I change certain things? I mean, I know you ultimately didn't, but like, was that an easy decision? Was that like a back and forth with the editors? Like, how did that all kind of play out?
Well, there was never a talk of changing things. I guess the main debate was, what do you do with the publishing schedule? When we got, so first it happens, and I'm not just saying this, like, at first you're just horrified. And I actually had a phone conversation. Someone called me the day he died, and people just make mistakes. So this is actually a really good person, but someone said to me, so this is good for your book, right? And I was just like, I was genuinely horrified by the question, because I obviously, if you could say, all right, this book never exists, but Kobe Bryant and the 9 people on the helicopter are alive, of course you do that. So the first reaction is horror and sadness and et cetera, et cetera. And then when you finally think about, well, there's this book, what do we do with it? I guess the debate was, like, first people are like, maybe you should move the publication date up. And to me, that was a non-starter. I wasn't going to take, you just don't take advantage of someone dying. It just doesn't feel right. You're not like, oh, we should recapitalize on so-and-so's death. Like, no. Then it was, is it too soon? The book came out September 22nd. The crash came in January. Should we move it back? And I just thought, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong, or if there is a right or wrong, I thought 8 months was a solid amount of time where you could come out with a book and it's not going to feel like you're taking advantage of a situation. Plus, it was already the previously scheduled date. So that was really the discussion, was what do we do with the release date? And ultimately, we just kept the original date.
I've heard you've been asked this question before, but just for people who didn't hear the answer like I was able to, I guess surprisingly to me, and I think you even acknowledged it was surprising to you, you didn't receive the type of blowback for just sharing the honest truth about Kobe through the words of his teammates, coaches, etc., that you thought you would have in light of what had happened to him in the recent year. Yeah,
no, it's funny. I have a cousin who lives in New Jersey named Daniel, and I sent him a copy of the book early, and this is before the book came out, and he wrote me back, and he's like, Jesus, this is going to be really bad. I'm really worried for you. And I was like, oh, really? Really? And then I sent it to one of the players. There's one of the guys in the book. I won't name him, but he was like, oh, I don't know. I'm worried how this is going to go over. And I was like, oh, really? And the more I thought about it, I was just, because people love Kobe Bryant, and they should. And people are passionate about him, and they should be. And he meant something to people. And I just was really concerned that people would see it as, here comes some jackass author capitalizing on Kobe Bryant's death. That they wouldn't know the backstory of the book. They're not going. Most people aren't on Twitter. Most people aren't following me on Facebook. They don't know the intricacies of it. They just see a book out, and maybe the thought is, up here's some jackass trying to make money off of the death of a famous basketball player. So I kind of steeled myself for that, And I would say here we are, whatever, almost 3 months later, I've probably gotten maybe 8 negative comments.
So in the book, and I'm not going to go into too much because I want people to read it, and I don't know that I could even encapsulate, the essence of it in 30 seconds, whatnot. But you speak to a ton of people. I mean, you get significant teammates, guys at the end of the bench, opponents, coaches, front. I mean, it's such a great. I think what I loved most about it, and I've read the USFL book and the Cowboys book of yours as well, but like there's so many perspectives here, so it's not like you don't walk away feeling like, oh, this is a pro fill in the blank book. I mean, it's just there are too many different voices, different backgrounds to feel that way. But there was, I mean, you really do get a pretty good picture of what Kobe was like and why he was perceived and treated the way he was, and why maybe the relationships he had or didn't have were that way. Was that a surprise to you? The depth of maybe how he carried himself and how that impacted others?
Yeah, I didn't know. It's funny because every now and then, again, like there hasn't been that much criticism, but the one main one is this guy went in with an axe against Kobe Bryant. And it's kind of like how you get, I'm sure you've gotten this sometimes. People are like, oh, he hates the fill-in-the-blank team. That's why he, or, oh, he hates that player. And you're like, I'm always the same. I'm like, listen, man, I'm a suburban dad with 2 kids. I don't care if your team wins or loses. I don't go in with a grudge. I don't care. I don't have any grudge against any players. I don't love Shaq. I don't hate Kobe. Like, I just want to tell the story accurately, And so for me, you sit down with Rick Fox, and you sit down with Samaki Walker, and you sit down with Shaq, and you sit down with Phil, and this narrative starts developing. And you have to remember, this is all before Kobe died. So it's not like people were sort of more reluctant to discuss him because they were concerned about sort of how it would come off. And just a repeated theme. It wasn't that they hated Kobe Bryant. It's certainly not that they hated Kobe Bryant at age 40, but that the Kobe Bryant of those years, 96 to 04, was kind of a pain in the ass and a tough guy to play with and not the best teammate and really bad when it came to sort of young players, rookies, undrafted free agents, guys like that. So when you hear it over and over again, it's not you being a biased author. It's you reporting what actually happened and what people say and what their recollections were and what their takes were. So I wouldn't say I was surprised by the fact that he was unliked. I would say I was surprised by the volume of that dislike.
Jeff, you might have mentioned it in the book, either the very beginning or the end. As a matter of fact, you probably did. But did he deny requests to talk?
Yeah.
Okay.
I tried reaching out, and he did not. So he and I wasn't. I always say this, not the rest. I always say, like, nobody owes it to me to talk. Like, nobody owes it to me. You're not making money off of it. You don't have final say in the book. I don't let you see the book before it comes out. So it's kind of like a guy like Shaq who wanted to talk. I think for guys like that, they see it as a sort of, part of their legacy, and this is who I was, and it's important to get it out. But I never was mad at Kobe Bryant for not talking. He has every right not to.
Did you have a relationship with him in any capacity before that, or I mean,
Zero.
Okay,
never even met him. Never met him.
The Shaq stuff. I think the Shaq stuff's fascinating. I guess to take a step back from just him, one of my oh my gosh, this is crazy, these are human beings 2 moments when I first started broadcasting for the Rangers was learning that, these guys are not just brimming with confidence at all times. Like, I don't know why the perception is like these guys, they have no confidence issues. They're professional athletes. Like, they make all this money. They probably all think they're just like the greatest guys out there. But then you realize like the dynamics in a clubhouse or a locker room, some guys do, but other guys need that reassurance, just like a 14-year-old kid trying to make the varsity team. And I guess what stood out to me about Shaq was that here's this guy who's just like larger than life, but he dealt with some of, I guess, the same internal challenges that, again, that 14-year-old kid might, and wanting to be liked and wanting to get that acceptance. That to me was really interesting. I'm curious, what was the biggest, like, oh, wow, like, I can't believe this, like, when you take a step back and consider all that you learned through the hours and hours of conversations you had with people, whether it made it into the book or it didn't?
All right, well, first of all, I want to say I think your observation is one that shocks a lot of sports fans, and I agree 1,000% with you. Sports, professional sports in particular, is a land of insecurity. There's always someone coming along to get your job, right? You can be cut at any time. In the NFL, contracts aren't guaranteed. There's always a young guy. There's always blah, blah, blah. There are people watching you. Why is this guy getting this endorsement? I'm not. Why is this guy? It's the idea that these guys, like, I get it because they make a lot of money and they're oftentimes really good looking and then they're athletic prime and blah, blah, blah. But there's so much insecurity. And I do think one thing about Shaq, like, the surprising thing to me, the thing that I did not know going in, you look at Shaq and you look at Kobe and you think, well, Kobe's going to be, he's 17 when he's drafted by the Lakers. He's going to come in, and I'm sure he was uncertain, and Shaq was this veteran, and he was established, and he was a highest-paid player in the NBA, and he's a secure. Like, Shaq was the one who really needed the love and needed people to respond to him and needed sort of to be embraced. And Kobe just didn't care. And that's not an insult to Kobe. It's kind of impressive. Like, he did not care. He was there to kill you from day one. And, first, I interviewed a guy, and I haven't talked about where I got this, but there's a guy who played at DePaul named David Booth. And he was with the Lakers in the summer of '96, and he was invited to training camp out of Summer League. So he's there for the first team meeting. And all the players are standing in a circle and introducing themselves. Del Harris is like, everyone introduce yourself. All right, hey, I'm Nick Van Exel. Hey, I'm Eddie Jones. Hey, I'm Shaq. Yo, I'm Kobe Bryant, Lower Merion High School. Nobody here is going to punk me. That was Kobe Bryant's introduction to the Lakers. And it was so different than Shaq. And Shaq is there buying people suits and taking them out for dinner and buying everyone Rolexes. And it's sincere, and he's the greatest teammate I've ever written about, greatest superstar teammate I've ever written about. But definitely part of it is a need for love and sort of being embraced. And Kobe just wanted to freaking stab you in the heart and dunk on you. And it's a pretty remarkable dynamic.
And that's definitely a theme that you kind of weave in and out throughout, sharing all these stories. I'm curious, Jeff, my writing experience ended my freshman year at USC with the Daily Trojan. I do writing, I guess, we'll do a blog here or there, and I think writing is such an important part of the process of broadcasting on air. I'll try and write stuff out. But as far as like writing for a newspaper or being a beat writer or even considering any sort of a book or a story like that, that's not something I've ever done. And so maybe this is a silly question, but you got hours and hours and hours of conversations. What's the process of now taking all of that, figuring out the directions you want to go and putting that into a book?
First of all, if you want to maintain your sanity, don't write a book. Like, enjoy it's freaking, it's the worst best. Like, it actually is. Writing a book is the way, if you want to do it well and dive into it. So just an example, I'm writing a Bo Jackson biography now, and I'm about 400 interviews in, and I'll probably end up interviewing 800 people for this book. And I go very old school. Like, I print them all out. I have them in folders divided by subject, Auburn, Raiders, Royals, White Sox, Angels year, all these folders spread out all over my bed. It drives my wife crazy. And I probably end up printing out 10,000 pages. I recycle it all at the end of the chronology of Bo Jackson's life. Like, I will go starting from the time he was a boyhood, find every article I can find, buy every book I can find. And then about 5 months before, so I spent a year and a half or whatever just researching nonstop all Bo Jackson. And then 5 months out, one day I'll sit down and I'll say, all right, let's start with the earliest stuff. And I'll get everything from his childhood, all the art, all the interviews, all the articles, all the books that have to do with Bo Jackson growing up in Bessemer, Alabama. And I'll just sit down and read them over, highlight, decide what I want to start with, and kind of just throw it all out there. And I'm a sufferer of health anxiety, and my health anxiety really kicks in when I'm in the middle of a book. Like, all of a sudden, the stress is so intense that I just am convinced I have, like, some disease that I didn't even know existed. It is the biggest mind mess ever. But at the end of the day, you do feel really accomplished, and there's something about there's something about getting a book in the mail for the first time that you wrote, opening the box and seeing it there, that still does it for me 9 books in.
Well, how do you balance that? Because like I think with anything, like I remember thinking, man, if I could ever just broadcast a Major League Baseball game, I'd have not a care in the world. Like life would be great. And now it's like, no, I like when I talk to students, I say, listen, you look at these people and you think, oh, everything's just perfect for them. Obviously, forget even just the personal stuff, families and all the stresses with that and challenges. But even professionally, it's like, you still want to, whether you're striving for more or that next step or whatever, like there are stresses that come with these jobs. How do you balance that, or how have you learned to cope with kind of what you just identified to still enjoy it to the point where it's like, I love doing this and I'm willing to deal with A, B, and C. I know it's coming, but the end result is just like so euphoric or so rewarding or whatever it might be.
I mean, I think part of it is I still really love it. Like, see, I mean, you started this interview by talking about me growing up in Mahopac, New York, and going to the library and loving sports. So here I am. I mean, just as an example, this is going to sound corny and dumb, but there was this play from Bo Jackson's career when he was with the White Sox, and he made this amazing throw at Yankee Stadium to get Mike Gallego of the Yankees sliding in the third. It's one of the best throws I've ever seen in my life. And so 2 days ago, Robin Ventura was playing third base. I called Robin Ventura, talked to him about the throw. He had these amazing, precise memories. Then I called Mike Gallego, who was the base runner in the play, called him up. He had these amazing, precise memories of this moment. That stuff just does it for me. Like whatever your high is in your job, those are the highs in my job. Like I love that. I love taking a moment from 30 years ago and diving deep and dissecting it again and dissecting it again and breaking it down. I'm just a real nerd in that way. And the other thing is I really need this. Like I was the kid in the library lining up to buy these books. My dream was to be a sports writer. Like that was actually, I don't know that many people in the world who get to actually live their dreams, for a million different reasons. And I'm just one of the freaking lucky people who actually gets to do what he set out to do. And for all the, like, it's almost like, it almost comes back to Kobe Bryant in a lot of ways. Like Kobe Bryant used to talk about how, it's not just about scoring 30 against the Blazers. It's about being in the gym at 4 a.m, taking 1,000 jumpers while your teammates are sleeping. And I really do believe whatever you do, like in this world, the satisfaction doesn't come without the hardship. Like there's no joy without the nightmare of sitting there thinking everything you write sucks, stewing over one word that you can't figure out. Like the joy and the satisfaction doesn't come without that. So I do try to remind myself when I'm at my lowest that you got to go through the lows to actually get to the high. The high doesn't exist without it.
I could probably, we might have to do this at some other point because they always cap me on timing, but there are a lot of things in there I'd love to kind of talk further with you about. I do want to, I'm going to pivot though, I guess along the same lines of joy and whatnot. Of all the conversations you've had, not just with the Ring Circus story, but all the ones you've done, all the books you've written, whatever it might be, what are some of the more unique experiences you've had in talking to people for the sake of contributing to the book? There's a fascinating story you share about J.R. Ryder. And showing up to his door, you could share that. But I'm curious, what are some of the other ones on top of that, if you wouldn't mind sharing that one too, that have kind of just been more than just your, hey, I'm Jeff, will you speak to me, phone call, email type of interactions?
Are you talking about just this book or any book?
And any book.
Oh, well, all right, so I wrote Brett Favre's biography, a book called Gunslinger. And I didn't know if he was going to talk to me, and he wound up not talking to me. And one day, he has a sister named Brandy, who's really nice, in Mississippi. And I found her on Facebook and added her as a Facebook friend, and she added me back. And I said, I wrote her, and I said, hey, I'm writing a book about your brother. And she wrote back, oh, that's cool. And I said, is there any way when I'm in Mississippi working on the book, if you would meet me for coffee? And she said, well, text me when you're here, and let's see. So I get to Kill, Mississippi, where Brett Favre grew up, and I DM her just on Facebook. And I'm like, hey, this is Jeff. I'm the guy writing the book. Any chance you want to get coffee? And she goes, well, I'm at the house. Why don't you just come by the house? My mom is here, too. And I said, okay. And I drive to the house, which is basically on the Favre homestead in the Kill, Mississippi. And I walk in, and she's there, and Benita, Brett's mom, is there. And the mom goes, so is Brett talking to you for the book? And I thought, well, that's it for this. And I said, well, I don't know. I don't even know. And she goes, all right, well, what do you want to know? I was probably there for 3 hours. They sent me home with Brett Favre's childhood scrapbooks and said, just getting back to us. And I was driving away, and I called my wife, and I was like, oh, man, I just had the best experience. I spent 3 hours with Brett Favre's mom and sister. And she goes to me, don't you think that's weird? And I said, well, what's weird about it? And she's like, we don't even know if he's talking to you, and the family just opened up. And I was like, you just kind of got to know what it's like here in Mississippi. And that was really really, really, really memorable. You mentioned, for the Laker book, one of the guys I really wanted to talk to is J.R. Rider. And J.R. Rider, he only spent 1 year, 99-2000 with the Lakers. And he was known as kind of not the best guy with the media when he was a player, and I didn't have a phone number for him. I only had an address. It was in Arizona, and I was in Arizona for, I think, a book event. So I said, I'm gonna drive to J.R. Ryder's house and knock on his door. So I drive out to this house. I get there way too early, like 9:30 in the morning, but I don't know. I knock on the door, and a kid answers, and I'm like, hey, is J.R. Rider here? He's like, hold on. Closes the door. A woman comes to the door. I'm like, hey, I'm looking for J.R. Rider. My name is Jeff Pearlman. I'm a writer. Well, hold on 1 second. And I hear some rumbling behind the door, like, rah, 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 rah. And here's J.R. Rider. He's like, who are you? And I'm like, hey, my name's Jeff Pearlman. I have my USFL book. I'm like, I wrote this book, and I'm working on a book about that. He's like, no, bro. You don't just come to my door, bro. You don't, no, bro, no. And then he opens the door, and he comes out, and I'm like, oh, crap. He's like, bro, man, that's so not cool. Just not cool, man. What are you working on? I'm doing a book about the Lakers, Shaq, Kobe. What's that book you have? Oh, it's a book I wrote about the USFL. He's like, is that the Trump League? I was like, yeah. He goes, all right, man, I'll talk to you. And he couldn't talk then, but he gave me his phone number. We ended up speaking for 2 hours, and he was awesome. So that is the other thing about this job. It sends you on these journeys. And I remember when I was young at Sports Illustrated, there was a writer named Jack McCallum. He's a great, great writer. And I just always remember him saying this. He said, you're not going to be the richest guy at your class reunion. You're going to be the one with the best stories by far. And that's definitely held true.